Welcome, welcome, welcome. Penny and I are very pleased to have you all with us. I think this is a record-breaking house. We're doing it. It's easier. Doing it a little bit differently this time. I'm going to do just housekeeping, and because we have 4 speakers, I'm not going to spend a lot of time. The biggest announcement is that there is a door back there that's unlocked. I'd rather you didn't leave through that at the end of the night, but if we have to get out of here quickly, you can. The big wooden door is open, and of course going out through the main room. I'm going to ask you to turn off your phones and other distracting devices. And when we're done, I'm going to ask you to stand up and kick the back of your chair and lean it against a wall. Don't worry about piling it neatly or anything. We'll be moving them out of the way. It's not to rush you. It's just to make room for everybody to continue the conversations that I just interrupted. We do have a very eclectic calendar still coming up. The first one is this Saturday. Norwich's own wonderful author-illustrator Lizzie Boyd has a brand new picture book, and we're celebrating that on Saturday morning. And then we're launching a story walk up Main Street to the library and back down the other side. So keep your eyes out for that. And then the last Thursday this month, we're having a discussion circle with Noah Eisenberg on his book about the movie. The title of the book is We'll Always Have Casablanca. And he's a professor of film, and he's up at Dartmouth for the summer. So it should be an interesting discussion group. And then in July, we have a great lineup working with the Meeting House series in Canaan. And we include Cynthia Huntington and Major Jackson as poets, novelist Alexander Chee, Megan Abbott, Rick Moody, and James Wright, for those of you who haven't had a chance to hear him in the Upper Valley, will be speaking as well. And there is a calendar out at the front desk. So tonight, I'm just going to turn the podium over to Nora, and she's going to introduce the other speakers and speak about this wonderful collection of Grace's writing, and then I understand the floor will be open for comments for a little while. And I have to say, I am in total disbelief that Grace has been gone for 10 years, and I'm so happy that this book is come out to bring her back into the forefront. But she actually never left us. I don't know if you noticed the poster here. We've had it in the store now for 17 years.
Hi everybody. Looks like I know a lot of you. I'm just very happy to have my mother's work back out in the air. I'm very happy about this book, and I want to introduce to you the co-editor, Kevin Bowen, whose idea it was, and he himself is a wonderful poet and actually a painter as well. And it really wouldn't be here without his inspiration. And of course, I'm quite happy about that. So Kevin can tell you a little more. And here he is.
Hi. It's really been an incredible honor to be involved in this, and it really was magical in a lot of ways. Grace used to come down to our workshop at the Joyner Center every year for probably the last 15 years before she passed away, and she was an integral part of that. And it was a workshop that brought together writers from Vietnam, veterans, anti-war activists, all the people that were really Grace's great audience. And for years after, what we would do, we would celebrate Grace's birthday. We would have birthday readings, and we would have them around Cambridge and Boston. And one of the things we noticed is that after the readings, people would begin talking, and they didn't know that much about the poems, or they knew the essays, some of the essays, they didn't know all of the stories. So it became apparent that it was really a need for a book like this. And as the years went on, and as events in the world continued in the path that they did, it became evident more than ever that we really need Grace's voice. And it was really very simple. I got in contact with Nora Nora said, yeah, let's do it. And then got in touch with Jonathan Galassi at FSG, and he said, yes, within a day. And actually, we received the news when Chung and I were in Hanoi. And it was at a festival, over 300 writers from around the world. And around the Well of the Quiet Heart in the Temple of Literature, there were portraits of writers from all over the world. And one of those portraits was Grace's. So she's never left us. She's always been there for us when we need us in spirit. And the idea of this book is to, just to have her with us in hand. And also for younger people, like my daughter, who met her but never, really grew up enough to understand her writing until later, so that they have an introduction to her work. For people who teach in the many disciplines, because Grace didn't work in just one discipline. She wasn't a genre writer, as people would maybe like to have her. She was connected to everything through life and through writing. So we're very happy to have worked on this and to be here tonight. So I think Marion is going to read first. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Here, I'll just put it right here. So she'll really.
Face an alternative.
But we need the
I was
microphone.
going
This
to
is
write a
Grace.
poem. I made a pie instead. It took about the same amount of time, of course. Of course, the pie was a final draft. A poem would have had some distance to go, days and weeks, and much crumpled paper. The pie already had a talking, tumbling audience among small trucks and a fire engine on the kitchen floor. Everybody will like this pie. It'll have apples and cranberries and dried apricots in it. Many friends will say, why in the world did you make only one? This does not happen with poems. Because of unreportable sadnesses, I decided to settle this morning for a responsive eatership. I do not want to wait a week, a year, a whole generation for the right consumer to come along.
Good evening. I'm Mariana Hirsch, and I was really fortunate to know Grace through many years up here in the Upper Valley, and also to walk through the streets of New York with her a few times. It's hard to read when we've just heard her voice, and when I read her work, I hear her voice, so I can't even begin to try. But I really want to begin by thanking Nora and Kevin for the gift of this book. I think it's just a wonderful way to bring Grace back to us and under new covers, and to rediscover a lot of our very favorite of her stories and essays and poems in one volume. I wanted to read a midrash on happiness. It's a story or a text that I heard Grace read many times, and Nora tells me it's because people wanted her to read it. So, midrash, for some of you who might not know, is a interpretation or commentary, sometimes verbal or sometimes written, on the written Torah. So it's an exegesis, and I also want to say that I was fortunate to celebrate some of the Jewish holidays with Grace. We were both atheists, but we liked some of the rituals, and having her write a midrash is just part of her teaching us what Judaism has to offer us. Midrash on happiness. What she meant by happiness, she said, was the following. She meant having, or having had, or continuing to have everything. By everything, she meant first the children, then a dear person to live with, preferably a man, but not necessarily. By live with, she meant for a long time, but not necessarily. Along with, and not in preferential order, she required 3 or 4 best women friends to whom she could tell every personal fact, and then discuss on the widest, deepest, and most hopeless level the economy, the constant, unbeatable, cruel war economy, the slavery of the American worker to the idea of that economy, the complicity of male people in the whole structure, the dumbness of men, including her preferred man, on this subject. By dumbness, she meant everything dumbness has always meant, silence and stupidity. By silence, she meant refusal to speak. By stupidity, she meant refusal to hear. For happiness, she required women to walk with. To walk in the city arm in arm with a woman friend, as her mother had with aunts and cousins so many years ago, was just plain essential. Oh, those long walks and intimate talks, better than standing alone on the most admirable mountain or in the handsomest forest or hay-blown field, all of which were certainly splendid occupations for the wind-starved soul. More important even, though maybe less sweet because of age, than the old walks with boys she'd walked with as a girl, that nice bunch of worried left-wing boys who flew, always slightly handicapped by that idealistic wing, into a dream of paid-up mortgages with a small room for opinion and solitude in the corner of home. Oh, do you remember those fellows, Ruthie? Remember? Well, I'm married to one. But she had, Faith continued, democratically tried walking in that beloved city with a man, but the effort had failed, since from about that age, 27 or 8, he had felt an obligation, if a young woman passed, to turn abstractedly away in the middle of the most personal conversation, or even to say confidentially, "Wasn't she something?" Or clasping his plaid shirt at the heart's level, "Oh my God." The purpose of this, perhaps to work a nice quiet appreciation into thunderous heartbeat, as he had been taught on pain of sexual death. For happiness, she also required work to do in this world and bread on the table. By work to do, she included the important work of raising children righteously up. By righteously, she meant along with being useful and speaking truth to the community, they must do no harm. By harm, she meant not only personal injury to the friend, the lover, the co-worker, the parent, the city, the nation, but also the stranger. She meant particularly the stranger in all her or his difference, who, because we were strangers in Egypt, deserves special goodness for life, or at least until the end of strangeness. By bread on the table, she meant no metaphor, but truly bread, as her father had ended every single meal with a hunk of bread. By hunk, she was describing one of the attributes of good bread. Suddenly she felt she had left out a couple of things. Love. Oh, yes, she said, for she was talking all this time to patient Ruth, and they were walking for some reason in a neighborhood where she didn't know the children, the pizza places, or the vegetable markets. It was early evening, and she could see lovers walking along Riverside Park with their arms around one another, turning away from the sun which now sets among the new apartment houses of New Jersey, to kiss. Oh, I forgot, she said, now that I noticed, Ruthie, I think I would die without love. By love, she probably meant she would die without being in love. By in love, she meant the acuteness of the heart at the sudden sight of a particular person, or the way over a couple of years of interested friendship, one is suddenly stunned by the lungs longing for more and more breath in the presence of that friend, or nearly drowned to the knees by the salty spring that seems to beat for years on our vaginal shores. Not to omit all sorts of imaginings which assure great spiritual energy for months, and when luck follows truth, years. Oh, sure, love. I think so too sometimes, said Ruth, willing to hear Faith out since she had been watching the kissers too, but I'm really not so sure. Nowadays it seems like pride. I mean, overweening pride when you look at the children and think we don't have time to do much. By time, Ruth meant more her personal time and the planet's time. Meant both her personal time and the planet's time. When I read the papers and hear all this boom, boom bellicosity, the guys out daring each other, I see we have to change it all, the world, without killing it absolutely, without killing it. That'll be the trick the kids will have to figure out. Until that begins, I don't understand happiness, what you mean by it. Then Faith was ashamed to have wanted so much and so little all at the same time. To be so easily and personally satisfied in this terrible place, when everywhere vast public suffering rose in reeling waves from the round Earth's nation-states, hung in the satellite-watched air, and settled in no time at all into TV sets and newsrooms. It was all there. Look up, and the news of halfway around the planet is falling on us all. So for all these conscientious and technical reasons, Faith was ashamed. It was clear that happiness could not be worthwhile with so much conversation and so little revolutionary change. Of course, Faith said, I know all that. But I do. Of course, Faith said, I know all that. I do. But sometimes, walking with a friend, I forget the world. So I just want to read one poem. And then, because Sunday's Father's Day, and because the first stanza of this poem comes into my head almost every single day that I ride the subway in New York or walk down the street. The poem is called Fathers. And I'd also like to read it for my 3 sons who are actually wonderful fathers and who knew Grace and loved her. Fathers. Fathers are more fathering these days. They have accomplished this by being more mothering. What luck for them that women's lib happened. Then the dream of new fathering began to shine in the eyes of free women and was irresistible. On the New York subways and the mass transits of other cities, one may see fatherings of many colors with their round babies on their laps. This may also happen in the countryside. These scenes were brand new, exciting for an old woman who had watched the old fathers gathering once again in familiar army camps and comfortable war rooms to consider the necessary eradication of the new fathering fathers who are their sons, as well as the women and children who will surely be in the way.
Kevin, you don't happen to know, oh, I just, hi, I'm Gerry Albarelli, and I was a student, I was Grace's student in 1976, 77, 78, 79, and then we became friends. I mean, remained friends for 30 years, and we talked a lot about teaching, and I wanted to read, I became a teacher, I taught English as a second language for a few years to Yiddish-speaking Hasidic boys in Brooklyn, and I'm not Jewish, and I used to go and see Grace afterwards, right, directly from the yeshiva, and tell her stories, and she would say, oh, write that down, darling, just the way you told me. Eventually, I mean, I did, and she and Bob Nichols had a press, and they published a book of mine which about that experience, as teaching stories from yeshiva. And I was telling Nora recently that I teach creative writing and oral history together, and it was really Grace who kind of introduced me to oral history. And so I had many conversations with her about teaching and oral history and keeping history in mind. And so this is how it starts. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Here are about 15 things I might say in the course of a term to freshmen or seniors, to 2 people or a class of 20. Every year the order is a little different because the student's work is different and I am in another part of my life. I do not elaborate on plans or reasons because I need to stay as ignorant in the art of teaching as I want them to remain in the art of literature. The assignments I give are usually assignments I've given myself, problems that have defeated me, investigations I'm still pursuing. 1. Literature has something to do with language. There's probably a natural grammar at the tip of your tongue. You may not believe it, but if you say what's on your mind in the language that comes to you from your parents and your street and friends, you'll probably say something beautiful. Still, if you weren't a tough, recalcitrant kid, that language may have been destroyed by the tongues of school teachers who were ashamed of interesting homes, inflection, and and language and left them all for correct usage. 2, a first assignment to be repeated whenever necessary by me or the class. Write a story, a first-person narrative, in the voice of someone with whom you are in conflict, someone who disturbs you, worries you, someone you don't understand. Use the situation you don't understand. 3, no personal journals, please, for about a year. Why? Boring to me. When you find only yourself interesting, you're boring. When I find only myself interesting, I'm a conceited bore. When I'm interested in you, I'm interesting. 4, this year I want to tell stories. I ask my father, now that he's old and not so busy, to tell me stories so I can learn how. I try to remember my grandmother's stories, the faces of her dead children. A first assignment for this year: tell a story in class, something that your grandmother told you about a life that preceded yours. That will remind us of our home language. Another story, at Christmas time or Passover supper, extract a story from the oldest person, told them by the oldest person they remember. That will remind us of history. Also, because of time shortage and advanced age, neither your father nor your grandmother will bother to tell unimportant stories. 5, is it possible to write about anything in the world? It's possible to write about anything in the world, but the slightest story ought to contain the facts of money and blood in order to be interesting to adults. That is, everybody continues on this earth by courtesy of certain economic arrangements. People are rich or poor, make a living or don't have to, are useful to systems or superfluous. And blood, the way people live as families or outside families or in the creation of families, sisters, sons, fathers, the bloody ties. Trivial work ignores these two facts and is never comic or tragic. May you do trivial work? Well, and then I'm going to skip ahead to 10. What is the difference between a story and a short story and a novel? The amount of space, any time, any decade can allow a subject and a group of characters. All this clear only in retrospect. Therefore, be risky. 11. A student says, "Why do you keep saying a work of art?" You're right, it's a bad habit. I mean to say a work of truth. 12. What does it mean to tell the truth? It means, for me, to remove all lies. A life full of holes was said truthfully at once from the beginning. Therefore, we know it can be done. But I am, like most of you, a middle-class person of articulate origins. Like you, I was considered verbal and talented and then improved upon by interested persons. These are some of the lies that have to be removed. 1. The lie of injustice to characters. 2. The lie of writing to an editor's taste or a teacher's. 3. The lie of writing to your best friend's taste, or the lie of the approximate word. 5. The lie of unnecessary adjectives. And 6. The lie of the brilliant sentences you love the most. And I want to read just a very short poem. It's called People in My Family. And it is I read that to my classes, what I just read to you. I read to my classes every year, especially the oral history and creative writing. And I read this poem because this poem called People in My Family really, and it does reminds me that to keep history in mind and that it really makes a difference where and when you were born. It's a very particular place and time you were born. People in my family. In my family, people who were 82 were very different from the people who were 92. The 82-year-old people grew up. It was 1914. This is what they knew. War, World War, war. That's why when they speak to the child, they say, "Poor little one." The 92-year-old people remember. It was the year 1905. They went to prison. They went into exile. They said, "Ah, soon." When they speak to the grandchild, they say, "Yes, there will be revolution. Then there will be revolution. Then once more, then the earth itself will turn and cry out, "Oh, I have been made sick." Then you, my little bud, must flower and save it.
My name is Chung. I work at the Joiner Center for the last 21 years. And because of that, I had a chance to meet with Liza Paley. And I could never forget the time I met her. And from that time on, she was such a wonderful person that although I basically came from Vietnam, a foreigner to her, and yet she made me feel completely at home. And every year she came to the Joiner Center, and we treasured the time that I could listen to her, could talk to her, and she left such a deep impression that when she died, I wrote a poem about my experience with her. And the poem is called Liza Paley. The Vietnamese has a saying that to build a 9-story tower, the best 9-story tower in the world, is nothing compared to saving a person's life, even one person. It has always been the culture of love and compassion. 10,000 miles from the other end of the earth, yet you could feel all the pain, the suffering, the injustice befalling a small country. You could hear screams in the night, muffled by the sounds of 500-pound bombs and the loud words of politicians masquerade their greed and domination in biblical foolishness. You just stood alone in that infamous New York Square. People went by, some spat at you, a traitor. I tell you now, Grace, there is no greater love than what is in the heart of such a traitor. No more courage than one person standing alone against all the mad dogs of the world. Your cold walks under the mid-noon sun warn the hurt of the nation. In the midst of all the heartless destruction, the song of humanity still sings. The bond of solidarity to what is just and true. It will last longer than momentary triumph of madness.
For Chung and I, so much of our connection with Grace is through the war and through Vietnam, traveling back and forth with her. And one of the great treats every year was in the summer, we would have Vietnamese writers and musicians come, and we would bring them to visit Bob and Grace up in Thetford. And that it became a sort of legendary trip. They used to say that this is the way writers all over the world should live. So I held many, many warm memories of those days. And I just want to say one thing before I'm going to read a couple of poems that are, I think, Thetford poems. It's been a great experience for me for the past 2 or 3 years to work with Nora on this, to be back and forth with her talking about these stories. And I don't know how many times we've read the stories and essays and poems as we've proofed, and we feel very much, so much that they're part of us. And so it's nice to be able to be here tonight in Thetford, and, with the spirit of the Vietnamese, and read these poems. It's called Goldenrod. This is a poem I remember that was posted at her window in the bedroom. If you looked out, you'd see the goldenrod. What would happen if there were a terrific shortage of goldenrod in the world? And I put my foot outside this house to walk in my garden and show city visitors my 2 lovely rose bushes and 3 remarkable goldenrod plants that were doing well this year. I would say, look, how on each of several sprigs there are 2-3 dozen tiny stems, and on each stem 3 or 4 golden flowers. Petals, stamen, pistil, and the pollen which bees love, but insufficiently. Otherwise, can you imagine the fields on rainy days in August, brass streaking the lodged hay heads, dull brass in the rain, and under the hot sun the golden flowers floating gold dust in August field for miles and miles? Then, Vera stopped at the flower called fireweed. 3 fireweed in that old field. Year after year, I watched from the kitchen window. I wonder when the earth is a repository of seed, a seed bank, a bed where seed rests comfortably, some say for years, waiting for the nudge from weather and light. Year after year, there are 3 firewood, no more, no less. Then Vera disappeared into the woods, and our dog Bea followed her, and I said to myself, work, and walked east toward the far sunny haze of Sparks Mountain, down into the swale which had gathered vervain, boneset, meadowsweet, where were the beginnings of those late asters that should have started their leaves toward blue and lavender September. Still, we are the gardeners of this world, and often talk about giving wildness its chance. It's I who cut the field too late, too early, right on time, and therefore out of the earth, which is a darkness of time seed and waiting root, the sunlight chose vervain, jewelweed, boneset. Just beyond our woodchuck-argued garden, a great nation of ants has lived for 15 years in a high sandy anthill, which I honor with looking and never disrupt. Nor have I learned their lesson of stubborn industry. They ask nothing except to be not bothered, and I personally agree, though it is my nation that has refined sugar in bowls of sugar far from their sandy home. I've often found them drunk and bathing. One of my favorite memories is coming up the hill and seeing Grace trimming Bob's beard. In Ireland, I won't tell that story. This is a Vietnam poem, That Country. This is about the woman of that country. Sometimes they spoke in slogans. They said, we patch the roads as we patch our sweetheart's trousers. The heart will stop, but not the transport. They said, we have ensured production even near bomb craters. Children, let your voices sing higher than the explosions of the bombs. They said, we have important tasks to teach the children that the people are the collective masters, to bear hardship, to instill love in the family, to guide the good health of the children. They must wear clothing according to climate. They said, once men beat their wives, now they may not. Once a poor family sold its daughter to a rich man, now the young may love one another. They said, once we planted our rice in any old way, now we plant the young shoots in straight rows so the imperialist pilot can see how steady our hands are. In the evening, we walked along the shores of the lake of the restored sword. I said, is it true? We are sisters? They said, yes, we are one family.
I chose to read this story really with my children in mind, who neither of whom are here. One of them is performing and the other's at work. Okay. It's called Traveling. My mother and sister were traveling south. The year was 1927. They had begun their journey in New York. They were going to visit my brother, who was studying in the South Medical College of Virginia. Their bus was an express and had stopped only in Philadelphia, Wilmington, and now Washington. Here, the darker people who had gotten on in Philadelphia or New York rose from their seats, put their bags and boxes together, and moved to the back of the bus. People who boarded in Washington knew where to seat themselves. My mother had heard that something like this would happen. My sister had heard it too. They had not lived in it. This reorganization of passengers by color happened in silence. My mother and sister remained in their seats, which were about 3/4 of the way back. When everyone was settled, the bus driver began to collect tickets. My sister saw him coming. She pinched my mother. "Ma, look!" Of course my mother saw him too. What frightened my sister was the quietness. The white people in front, the black people in back, silent. The driver sighed, said, "You can't sit here, ma'am. It's for them," waving over his shoulder at the Negroes among whom they were now sitting. "Move, please." My mother said, "No." He said, "You don't understand, ma'am. It's against the law. You have to move to the front." My mother said, "No." When I first tried to write this scene, I imagined my mother saying, "That's all right, mister, we're comfortable. I can't change my seat every minute." I read this invention to my sister. She said it was nothing like that. My mother did not try to be friendly or pretend innocence. While my sister trembled in the silence, my mother said for the third time, quietly, "No." Somehow, finally, they were in Richmond. There was my brother in school among so many American boys. After hugs and my mother's anxious looks at her young son, my sister said, "Vic, you know what Mama did?" My brother remembers thinking, "What? Oh, she wouldn't move?" He had a classmate, a Jewish boy like himself, but from Virginia, who had had a public confrontation with a Negro man. He had punched that man hard, knocked him down. My brother couldn't believe it. He was stunned. He couldn't imagine a Jewish boy wanting to knock anyone down. He had never wanted to, but he thought, looking back, that he had been set down to work and study in a nearly foreign place and had to get used to it. Then he told me about the Second World War, when the disgrace of black soldiers being forced to sit behind white German POWs shook him, shamed him. About 15 years later, in 1943, in early summer, I rode the bus for about 3 days from New York to Miami Beach, where my husband, in sweaty fatigues, along with hundreds of other boys, was trudging up and down the streets and beaches to prepare themselves for war. By late afternoon of the second long day, we were well into the South, beyond Richmond, maybe South Carolina or Georgia. My excitement about travel in the wide world was damaged a little by a sudden fear that I might not recognize Jess or he me. We hadn't seen each other for 2 months. I took a photograph out of my pocket. Yes, I would know him. I had been sleeping, waking, reading, writing, dozing, waking, so many hours. The movement of the passengers was something like a tide that sometimes ebbed and now seemed to be noisily rising. I opened my eyes to the sound of new people brushing past my aisle seat and looked up to see a colored woman holding a large sleeping baby who, with the heaviness of sleep, his arms so tight around her neck, seemed to be pulling her head down. I looked around and noticed that I was in the last white row. The press of travelers had made it impossible for her to move further back. She seemed so tired, and I had been sitting and sitting for a day and a half at least. Not thinking, or maybe refusing to think, I offered her my seat. She looked at the left and the right as well as she could. Softly she said, "Oh no." I became fully awake. A white man was standing right beside her, but on the other side of the invisible absolute racial border. Of course, she couldn't accept my seat. Her sleeping child hung mercilessly from her neck. She shifted a little to balance the burden. She whispered to herself, "Oh, I just don't know." So I said, "Well, at least give me the baby." First she turned, barely looked at the man beside her. He made no move. So to my surprise, but obviously out of sheer exhaustion, she disengaged the child from her body and placed him on my lap. He was deep in child sleep. He stirred, but not enough to bother himself or me. I liked holding him, aligning him along my 20-year-old woman's shape. I thought ahead to that holding, that breathing together that would happen in my life if this war would ever end. I was so comfortable under his nice weight, I closed my eyes for a couple of minutes, but suddenly opened them to look up into the face of a white man talking. In a loud voice, he addressed me. "Lady, I wouldn't have touched that thing with a meat hook." I thought, oh, this world will end in ice. I could do nothing but look straight into his eyes. I did not look away from him. Then I held that little boy a little tighter, kissed his curly head, pressed him even closer so that he began to squirm. So sleepy, he reshaped himself inside my arms. His mother tried to narrow herself away from that dangerous border, too frightened at first to move at all. After a couple of minutes, she leaned forward a little, placed her hand on the baby's head, and held it there until the next stop. I couldn't look up into that mother's face. I write this remembrance more than 50 years later. I look back at that mother and child, how young she is. Her hand on his head is quite small, though she tries by spreading her fingers wide to hide him from the white man. But the child I'm holding, his little face as he turns toward me, is the brown face of my own grandson, my daughter's boy, the open mouth of the sleeper, the full lips, the thick little body of a child who runs wildly from one end of the yard to the other, leaps from dangerous heights with certain experienced caution, muscling his body, his mind, for coming realities. Of course, when my mother and sister returned from Richmond, the family at home wanted to know how Vic was doing in school along all those Gentiles. Was the long bus ride hard? Was the anti-Semitism really bad or just normal? What happened on the bus? I was probably present at that supper, the attentive listener and total forgetter of information that immediately started to form me. Then, last year, my sister, casting the net of old age, through which recent experience easily slips, brought up that story. First, I was angry. How come you never told me about your bus ride with Mama? I mean, really, so many years ago. I don't know, she said. Anyway, you were about 4 years old. And besides, maybe I did. I asked my brother why we'd never talked about that day. He said he thought now that it had had a great effect on him. He had tried unraveling its meaning for years. Then life, family, work happened. So I imagined him a youngster, really, a kid from the Bronx in Virginia in 1927, where he was a stranger there himself. In the next couple of weeks, we continued to talk about our mother, the way she was principled, adamant, and at the same time so shy. What else could we remember? Well, I said, I have a story about those buses too. Then I told it to them, how it happened on just such a journey, when I was still quite young, that I first knew my grandson, first held him close, but could protect him for only about 20 minutes, 50 years ago. And I'm going to read one more thing, a poem that everybody here said they were going to read and they didn't. So, so I'm going to read it. It's called The Hard-Hearted Rich. Oh, how hard the hard-hearted rich are when they meet a working person in their places of work, a cab or a restaurant kitchen, and the hard beats and eases the mouth into saying, well, they do get minimum wage, probably, and when they meet an ordinary bum or maybe a homeless person on their street or broad boulevard standing on the pavement common to all the good shops, holding a paper cup or cap, asking for change, oh, say the hard-hearted rich, they will use it for drugs or drink and be found at midnight in drunken sleep in the doorway of one of the best shops of all. Then the hard-hearted rich, and there are many, many in our city, just as there are many, many women and men working in hard-driven poverty or not working at all. Oh, the hard-hearted rich move into the glorious evening of drinking and talking and eating and drinking again, into sleep in their queen-sized beds, as though they were queens with kings beside each other. And it's night, and the moon's bright, and the moon's bright light falls through the huge windows. Then they decide to try love as a kind of a heart softener. They are tired, and they think to try love. Okay? And I think now people can speak if they want to speak, or ask questions of any of us if they want to. I think Liza has a microphone to pass around. But no one wants to talk.
Thank you all so much. This follows on what you just read, Nora. But I want to thank Kevin and the Joiner Center. That's where I first met Grace, at one of the amazing workshops that you all have put on for so many years that have been an inspiration to so many of us. So thank you. So this is a poem written by another poet about a reading that Grace was at. And she was supposed to speak. But all of a sudden she wasn't there, and no one knew where she was. So this is what this poet wrote. She said, the title is Grace Paley Reading. Finally, the audience gets restless, and they send me to hunt for Grace. I find her backing out of the bathroom, bending over, wiping up her footprints as she goes with a little sheet of toilet paper, explaining, in some places, after the lady mops, the bosses come to check on her. I just don't want them to think she didn't do her job. And then I've been going over boxes in my basement, and I found this wonderful article from the Boston Globe from 1998 about Grace. And there's this wonderful picture, when you mentioned that, Kevin. Here's the picture of Grace in her yard. So this was when she was 75, raking up her yard with all the strength that she had. So I wanted to give this to you, Nora.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That's great.
Thank you. My name's Pam Harrison, and I had the great privilege of working for Grace for about 4 years, late in that lovely little house that's in the picture. The lovely little house that had a doorway under which a chipmunk ran in and out at will, and where I would go in and help. I would go in and help Grace organize her papers, which by the time I usually arrived from week to week, were in somewhat of a mountain on her desk, and I couldn't see the desk, and the goal was to sort through things and get things filed away properly. But of course, the mail that was coming in from all over the world never let up. And so we were always looking for the wood beneath the papers, and very seldom got down that far. But one day we were working, and I thought this, I tell myself, remember this story a lot, because it seemed to me to be so much of who Grace was. There we are with the pile, and there are filing cabinets and things under the bed and in all the corners, because there never was enough room for all the missives that came her way. But I in my simple way, was trying to start at the beginning and work my way down. I think one day she must have gone, this poor young woman, and she pulled a piece of paper out from the middle of the pile, right? And she held it up, and she said, "Oh my," she said, "this was an invitation to read 3 months ago." She said, "File it under betrayal." She was an honest woman, wasn't she?
Yeah, I'm Beth Dingman. I have another story about the house a little bit. She had promised to write a blurb for one of the books we published, and months went by, no blurb, and calls didn't seem to do anything. So I decided to go up and just make her sit and do it while I was sitting. So I drove up there one day and she invited me in and everything. She said, "Well, I'm busy." She had that little carpet sweeper. It wasn't electric, it was just a carpet sweeper. And she said, "Well, I'd have to clean this rug." She said, "New York Times is coming to interview me this afternoon."
Well, while we're on the subject of the house, I did a lot of work on that house, and my dad, Grace's husband, his dad built the house and mother built the house. And but my story is very short. It's just about a hammer. So I was hammering in a room upstairs because there was a fire at one time, and there was an upstairs after that. And I was hammering with a very large hammer. It was very noisy, and Grace was napping or in the front room. And I came down at some point and said, "I know it's really loud. I won't be long." And she said, "I love the sound of a hammer." She says, "It's one of my favorite things."
Okay, thank you. I'm really glad to see you all, and I'm glad this has happened.
We'll continue visiting.